Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. identified three evils plaguing Western civilization in a speech called The Three Evils of Society that he delivered at the National Conference on New Politics in 1967. He says, "We have deluded ourselves into believing the myth that capitalism grew and prospered out of the Protestant ethic of hard work and sacrifice. The fact is, capitalism was built on the exploitation and suffering of Black slaves and continues to thrive on the exploitation of the poor, both Black and white, both here and abroad." Episode 4 is entitled Capitalism. It sheds light on the myth versus reality of American capitalism, as well as how American capitalism came to be. A popular idea around American capitalism is that wealth is obtained through individual achievement and effort. You get out what you put in. But in reality, most capitalism is based on the exploitation of labor, and its cornerstone is chattel slavery. Let's face it, Europeans brought Africans to the Americas to exploit them for labor. The goal was to amass wealth for themselves off the backs of African slaves. Slave-grown cotton fueled early American economy. It was the nation's first big business. Slave-grown cotton would also serve as a catalyst for the Industrial Revolution. There's a myth that Black people don't work hard, when in fact, Black people work extremely hard, often for minimum pay and no health benefits. History shows that meager earnings have never been enough to supersede poverty in this country. And this country has always had a wealth divide, and there are no signs that the playing field will be leveled or that those struggling to obtain wealth will ever reach the top. In 2019, the top 10% of families owned 76% of the wealth, 40% owned 22% of the wealth, and the bottom 50% owned just 1% of the wealth. This episode explores the evolution of labor exploitation through major corporations such as Amazon. Viewers get an inside look from the perspective of employees turned activists. We learn of what the conditions are like inside the second largest employer in the country. We learn about Amazon's high turnover rate, grueling work requirements, and sometimes dangerous work environment. In this fast-paced environment, productivity metrics are king. Productivity is paramount. Workers are pushed to exceed expectations. Such work conditions harken memories of chattel slavery in that Black bodies were business assets. Slave owners maintained extensive record keeping of slaves, slave schedules, slaves' market value, slaves' age and level of skill. In a callous way, capitalism has historically equated the value of human beings to profit margin. Nicole Hannah-Jones talks about her own father and uncle's experience, how hard they worked, how no matter how hard they worked, they never seemed to get ahead. Both died before they could access the Social Security benefits that they had worked for decades to earn. Nicole's cousin couldn't go to college because she needed to work to support her family. She describes how she began working at a retail store for around $5 an hour. After 15 years, she was still not making $10 an hour. During the pandemic, she finally received enough money to live comfortably. It was more money than she had ever earned working. Half of this country's workers are employed in low-wage jobs. Blacks suffer the greatest level of poverty and access to the lowest amount of wealth. Historian Robin D.G. Kelly states, "Value in wages is determined by differences such as race, gender, and age." He argues that people are not exploited equally, that racial capitalism is capitalism, that there is no such thing as race-neutral capitalism. The realization of working so hard but having little to show is a defeating one. Knowing that you're doing your best to provide for your household, but you barely getting by, and you certainly don't have enough to save or pass on to your children is a dreadful feeling. In spite of the bleak outlook, the power of the people is undefeated. As noted in this episode, more of the labor force is striking for better hours, wages, working conditions, and benefits. A federal labor official upheld the results of a historic union election at Amazon's fulfillment center, JFK 8 in Staten Island, in January of this year. Activists and organizers at the Amazon facility in Bessemer, Alabama, continue to rally for a union at their location. Workers around the country have felt inspired to push for change as well. During the first half of 2022, union activists won more elections than they have in the last 20 years. One of the final topics discussed in this episode is convict leasing. I had not heard of it prior to watching this episode, but what I learned is that it was another treacherous form of exploitation and dehumanization. Convict leasing was a system used by Southern states after the Civil War ended. It allowed states to lease prisoners to private railways, mines, and large plantations. As with chattel slavery, states profited, but prisoners earned no pay and faced inhumane, dangerous, and often deadly work conditions. Alabama was the last state to end the practice of convict leasing in 1928. You may be wondering how this system thrived and proved sustainable. Well, although the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1865, prohibiting slavery and involuntary servitude, it explicitly exempted those convicted of a crime. Southern state legislators cleverly passed black codes. These new laws targeted black people and subjected them to criminal prosecution for offenses such as loitering, breaking curfew, vagrancy, having weapons, and not carrying proof of employment. Southern whites lost the right to have African Americans in bondage as slaves, but that was no matter because they simply conceptualized a new means of subjugating them. This concludes the review of episode 4 of the 1619 Project on Hulu. It was another insightful and informative episode. If you haven't already watched this docuseries, then I highly encourage you to do so. Thank you for joining me. Until next time.